friend. Welcome to the Fruitful Fertility Podcast. Do you want to better understand your body so you can get pregnant naturally? Do you find yourself up late at night Googling how to ovulate on your own or natural fertility tips? Do you feel lost on what your next step should be? Hey, I'm Tori, a registered nurse, Christian fertility coach, and your new TTC BFF. When I started my fertility practice, I realized how much the modern medical system was missing when it came to supporting women trying to get pregnant. I knew God had called me to this space to bridge that gap and provide more natural fertility support and education. With time and a little trial and error, I found a foundational way to assess infertility cases and get better results. In this podcast, you will finally understand how your body and fertility work, support to stay off that emotional roller coaster, and a proven strategy to improve ovulation and increase your fertility naturally. If you're ready to get started, drop those ovulation sticks and grab a pen because, girl, you look fertile to me. Alrighty, guys, welcome to another episode of the Fruitful Fertility Co. podcast. I have a very special episode today with a guest, Caitlin Estes. She is a certified fertility care practitioner with a Master of Divinity degree, owner of Woven Natural Fertility Care, and her passion is to educate and empower women as they navigate their cycles and fertility so they can make more informed decisions around family planning, women's health, and fertility treatment decisions, which y'all know is right up our alley over here. So, Caitlin, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Tori. Glad to be here.
So let's start with your story of how you got into fertility and how you got started with the fertility awareness method.
Yeah, I have been a certified fertility care practitioner for the last 8 years, but I never saw this coming. I did not know that this was going to be my area of work and my absolute passion. I discovered the particular method of fertility awareness that I teach, which is the Creighton method, back when I was looking for a way to plan my family when my husband and I were engaged. So I had no idea if there was a natural way to plan a family. I just had never learned about it, never heard anyone else talking about it. So I went looking online. I found a good local resource, heard about all my options, and I ended up choosing the Creighton method. And I learned so much about my own cycles and my own reproductive health. I became really passionate about it, and I was telling all my friends about it, and they were really interested. And I became the friend that knew a lot about women's health, which just seemed wild to me. I had no formal training whatsoever, and yet I knew more than a lot of my friends about their own reproductive health. So that's when I started thinking, God may be inviting me to pursue this a little bit. It could be that God's on this movement to educate women about their bodies and their design. And he may be inviting me to be a part of that. And that's absolutely been the case. And I've loved it. And here we are 8+ years later.
Yes, that is such a great story. I feel like one of the ways women are so underserved in the healthcare field is that we really don't know how our bodies work. We don't really understand our cycles or what anything is. And even me, I'm a registered nurse and I've been in healthcare for 10 plus years. And I don't think I really knew what the fertility awareness method was or anything about like cervical fluid or basal body temperature, any of that till I was really like in my 30s. I think even after I had children, I have two children, and I don't even think I learned that till afterwards. So it's so
Hmm.
funny how like when you do learn this stuff about cycle charting and fertility awareness, how it's like, oh, like these are just signs. These are like very natural signs, but we have no idea because we're really not taught in school and we're definitely not taught at our doctor's office.
That's exactly right. I have a really good friend who's a nurse practitioner, and she said in all the education she went through in order to be a nurse practitioner, she got incredible instruction on how to choose the right birth control pill for each woman, depending on their medical history and possibility of, having a blood clot or a stroke or something. But she had maybe a 45-minute lesson on how the reproductive system actually works. And so I think that explains a lot as to why we women don't know a lot of information, because even our medical professionals aren't getting the kind of education that could be beneficial to them too.
That is Yes, spot on. I absolutely agree. I think it's not that I feel like sometimes when I'm talking about like how we're neglected a little bit at our OB offices, that I'm kind of making the OBs the bad guys, but it's like they're not the bad guys. They just weren't taught either. Like none of us were
Yes.
taught, which is such a shame. But why it's so good to get to do what we do and even get to talk about this on the podcast. So let's just dive right into what is the fertility awareness method, the Creighton method you're talking about, and how can it help couples conceive?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think it's helpful to understand what is fertility awareness methods or what are fertility awareness methods, because that's really a big umbrella category. So basically, every woman's cycle has multiple reproductive organs and hormones that are involved in that process. So each one of those provides a sort of biomarker that allows us to understand a little bit or sometimes a lot of what it's doing. So where you are in your cycle, what's going on, what hormones are dominant, when your next period is going to start, whether you're fertile or infertile. And so over the years, we've developed consistent, effective ways of interpreting those female reproductive biomarkers to understand the cycle. So, well, some of the examples of the biomarkers are temperature. So you mentioned basal body temperature, cervical mucus. There's now hormone monitoring, like looking at your LH rise through OPKs and things like that, even cervical position. And all of those, when we can understand them, point us back to really being able to interpret the female reproductive system. So the Creighton method is one of those options. There are lots of different methods. I personally chose the Creighton method way back when because it had one biomarker that I had to keep track of, and that felt realistic to me, cervical mucus. And also, cervical mucus gives an incredible amount of information. And so, if you can understand your cervical mucus, there's actually a field of health associated with it. There are OBGYNs, there are nurse practitioners, there are all sorts of medical professionals who are trained in interpreting a Creighton chart, and then they can use that to actually help diagnose and treat underlying issues. But I think any method of fertility awareness or fertility appreciation is worth looking into, certainly because of the health benefits and understanding where you are and what's going on when. But also, there's this sense of understanding how God designed us to function as women. So, our reproductive systems often get a lot of negative attention. They can be really painful, they can be frustrating, they can be really irregular and confusing. But the more we understand about what's going on behind the scenes and how we were designed, it can help us to, one, identify some of the health issues. Maybe it's why it's not going the way that it should be, but also it can help us to reconnect to how God created us as women and how that can actually be a beautiful thing. So I think that's important too. It's empowering and it also helps us to have that deeper encounter with God as well.
I love that. So multifaceted. So like empowering, like you said, empowering to understand your body and to connect with God deeper, especially in a fertility journey, which could be a very hard journey. I feel like that's so important. And I love that you put said that. That is great. Would you say that
And
you think that the Creighton method is the easiest fertility awareness? Like you were saying, you picked it because you had one biomarker to keep up with. Because a lot of what we talk about on this podcast and what I try to teach my clients is like keep it so simple. Like do not make it complicated. Keep things, everything, the food you take, the supplements you take, so stinking simple.
yes, and that's fantastic advice, by the way. I love realistic recommendations, so that's really good. I love to hear that. Okay, so I may be a bit biased because this is what I learned, and this is the field that I've dedicated, the last 8 years of my life to. But I personally do believe that it's the easiest fertility awareness method, but in the sense that it is you're going to get the most information for the least amount of work. So it's not the easiest in the sense of you could just do a hormone monitor that you pee on a stick and stick it into a little thing that's going to interpret it for you, and that's all you have to do. And that seems much easier. but you're not going to get necessarily the health data associated with that. So, fertility awareness methods can be used in two main ways. You can use it to identify your window of fertility, so when you could possibly conceive a pregnancy, and then you can also use it for women's health, reproductive health, and identifying and treating those issues. So, there are some fantastic methods of understanding when you are fertile that don't necessarily provide the health benefit as well. And then there are, well, I wouldn't say necessarily vice versa. You either get more information or you don't. But there are different options. So you could do basal body temperature. By the way, that's a long, trusted, very effective way of confirming that that ovulation has occurred. So, to the best of our ability with a natural way of looking at that. So it's more of a retrospective system. You can look back and see that shift in temperature to know, okay, this is pointing to I probably did ovulate. That was my window of fertility. But it can be influenced by other factors. So if you are taking your temperature with a thermometer, maybe you had your mouth open, you slept with your mouth open, or you got up less than 3 hours ago, or maybe you have a cold or you're fighting off a fever. All of those things are going to affect temperature. But with basal body temperature, you also use cervical mucus. So you often use those together in what's called the symptothermal method. Then there's hormone monitoring that I talked about, and there are a lot of new monitors available. So that's a more popular choice to make. And I think that it is incredible. It's very informative, but it is often pretty intimidating. So there's so much information that it can sometimes be difficult to know what to do with that, especially if you don't have standard cycles. So this goes back to why I particularly love the Creighton model system because it uses cervical mucus only. And I feel like that's the most accurate and the most informative. So for identifying the window of fertility and for looking at the underlying health issues that go on. And it doesn't matter if you have regular or irregular cycles, you can use it either way. You can be in any reproductive stage of life and successfully use it. And it's also a prospective method, meaning that you can actually see that window of fertility coming. It's not just, oh, I think it's over. It's like, oh, I know I'm in it right now. And so, especially for couples who are trying to conceive, you can identify that window of fertility when you're actually in it instead of not just when it's over. And that's going to be way better than using an app, for instance. I know those are extremely popular, but it's way more effective than using an app to kind of guess that. And it really is empowering because I've had clients, in fact, last year, I had a client who told her OBGYN that she wanted to try to conceive, and her OBGYN told her to just try to be together with her husband every other day for a year, and if she didn't get pregnant, to come back in. That is such unnecessary pressure, and it's also inaccurate,
Exhausting.
exhausting, all the things. And so it's so much better to actually know when those days are where you could conceive a pregnancy.
Yes, I agree so much. I often find with my clients that regardless of what method they're using to do their cycle charting or their fertility awareness, they aren't like you were talking about the proactive, like knowing before you get to your fertile window. So they're timing intercourse on the day they're ovulating. And I'm like, well, really, we need to back up to these 4 days over here and make sure we're hitting these. And I always joke, I have terrible metaphors, but I always joke that it's like, we want like a basket of sperm waiting for that egg to drop in. We
Yes.
don't want the basket to miss the egg when it drops in. So I love that being proactive. Yes, because the whole waiting a year anyways drives me crazy. It's one of my biggest pet peeves in the fertility world.
Hmm.
So it's like there are so many things we can work on before that year. And
Yes.
our fertility awareness method and tracking and all that is absolutely one of them. So I love that. So that takes us right into the next question, which is why is it a good idea to begin using fertility awareness methods before considering IVF?
Yeah, and that's a good question because I think when you do go through that experience of working with your local OBGYN and you try for a year and it doesn't happen, there's usually a process that starts at that point. That's kind of the standard protocol. Your OBGYN may offer you a few cycles on Clomid or letrozole, but there's not going to be a lot of diagnostics going on. And if you don't happen to conceive, then they're going to immediately refer you to an IVF clinic. So the medical professional there is called a reproductive endocrinologist, and they do specialize in artificial reproductive technology. So their standard process at that point is going to be some initial labs, an ultrasound, HSG, semen analysis. Okay, so if nothing comes up at that point, then they'll usually try an IUI, maybe medicated cycles if you want them, and then immediately IVF. And they're often told, these couples are often told, IVF is really your best option. So if there's not something glaringly obvious that comes up in those first, initial tests, then most go into this category of unexplained infertility. Well, is it really all that unexplainable, or do we just need to dig a little deeper? Okay,
Exactly.
so you and I are on the same page about that. In fact, I'm not sure in all my years of doing this, I've ever found a couple that truly experienced unexplainable infertility. There's almost always something, and we just have to look for what it is. So, with the Creighton system specifically, it does help you identify what those possibilities are. And then you can work with, I prefer to work with a restorative reproductive medical professional to identify what those things are and treat them. So, you can see what's maybe coming up back as normal in your tests. So, your lab results may say normal, but when we're looking at the chart, it's like, they may be normal, but they're not optimal.
Mhm.
And these things can all add up. Obviously, our body is an intricate system, we're mind, body, spirit, but then within our body, we're all these different systems working together. And so it's important that we're looking at that overall health. So there are doctors trained in methods of fertility awareness, specifically the Creighton model system, and they want to actually use your input to help you identify the problem and treat it. So, like I mentioned, these are called restorative reproductive medical professionals, and they are OBGYNs, they're physicians, they're nurse practitioners, and they want to restore your reproductive health, not bypass it. And ultimately, that's what IVF does. Like, let's take the female body out of the equation. Let's try to make things outside of her body. Let's try to manipulate her body with lots of really high doses of synthetic hormones and all sorts of side effects. And let's see what we can make happen. Instead, we're really focused on healing the woman's reproductive cycle and giving her the best health possible, both for her and for her baby, because there can be some pretty serious negative side effects for babies born through IVF. So it's a much gentler approach, and I think that it can actually be more effective than IVF. And that sounds controversial, but I encourage you to look through some reproductive restorative research that's out there. In fact, there's a case study by Dr. Phil Boyle that was done just a couple years ago, 2022. And there was a woman who had been unable to have a baby for 16 years, 16 years of infertility, 8 unsuccessful IVF transfers. And if anybody listening has been through an IVF transfer, like all that goes into that. And they conceived with restorative reproductive medicine, their like cycle optimization after 5 cycles.
That's amazing.
5 cycles. They now have a daughter, that they're raising. So it's incredibly effective when we really go back to God's design and what I believe is what women deserve. Like women deserve this more dignified women's health care. And I've found the Creighton system to be a way to participate in that and actually have a seat at the table, partner with doctors who care about what our experience is and helps us to really diagnose and treat those issues so we can have a better quality of life.
I love like even the language there. I've got my minor in college was English, but I love language and even just that of like gentleness and restorative, like, and not, and because I agree, like I feel like IVF is a big manipulation, like we are not
Mm,
trusting our bodies, we are manipulating them into carrying a pregnancy, and you just don't get your best results that way. And talking about
yeah.
statistics too, I sat down and, looked up the statistics for IUI, which was, I believe, 19%, like in the teens,
Yeah.
in 13 to 19%. And a lot of fertility clinics make clients do at least three IUIs before they are even allowed to do IVF because of insurance reasons, which is a whole soapbox for another day. But then
Hmm.
IVF only had like a 20 to 39% effect, 20 to 39% success rate for the first round. So now we're looking
Hmm.
at a less than 50% chance it's going to work for thousands and thousands of dollars. And then I sat down and looked at the clients I've worked with and the natural methods we use, and I came up with a 66% success rate. So when you're
Hmm.
saying, it's actually more effective, we are led to believe in our modern world and medical society that we cannot get pregnant without IVF and intervention and surgery and force. But really, when we get back to the root cause and understanding our bodies, and like you said, a place of nourishment, a place of understanding, a place of gentleness, like that is, we just see so much in that. I've had so many clients that had literally never been pregnant in over 2 years. I keep joking that my claim to fame is 2 and 2 because I've had so many clients come to me that were trying to get pregnant for 2 years, had never been pregnant in 2 years, and in 2 months they turned up pregnant. It's just like a weird
Yeah.
coincidence. And that's not the case for all clients. I wish it was, but it was just a weird, I'm like, so how
Hmm.
is it that we've been told this $20,000 process that's very painful and hard and, just emotionally and physically is better than just understanding what's going on with our body and how we can nourish it from a root cause. So I feel like I get real
Absolutely.
passionate about that. But yeah, everything you said was so good.
And I think everyone that really cares about women and wants to honor and respect them feels that same way.
Yeah.
So even the people who are in the reproductive endocrinology business, like they're not mean-spirited,
No.
they're not evil. There's none of that. It's just that's what they've been taught is the most effective way, and they want to help see families created. And so that's a beautiful intention, but we've just found that it's not the always the best way to honor the dignity of women and how we're created and how we function. And so it is okay to look into other options. I think a lot of times we think if I'm serious about having a baby, then I'm going to pursue IVF.
Mhm.
But if you're serious about having a baby, then you can look into all of the options. You gave the percentages 20 to 39%. And I believe those sound accurate because I've looked it up in the past too. And I want to encourage people to look into that 39% because those are often women 25 years or younger
Mhm.
who go through this process who have been trying to have a baby for a year or less. So the stats are so wide like that because it really does impact where they are biologically, what their reproductive health is. And so if you have a couple that goes in to do IVF and the only reason they haven't conceived is because there's been no diagnostic workup to find out what's going on, and maybe they're actually pretty healthy, they were just timing it wrong, or they had low progesterone or something simple like that, then yeah, IVF is going to be successful, but it doesn't mean that it was necessary. So we want women to go through, like you said, the most gentle process possible that also is honoring to them as a human being.
Yes, absolutely. I love that. Another word. I'm picking out all these words I love, but just honoring women. Like I love that sentiment because that really is the heart of what I do, and I know of what you do too, is like to give these women, like, put faith in themselves and their body back into the equation because they've been told by doctors like you have to do IVF. You only have a 3% chance of getting pregnant naturally. It's like, well, with
Yes.
God and the right steps, you have an abundant amount of chances of getting pregnant. So yeah, I love that.
Yes.
Like,
You said you have a coincidence earlier of the 2 years and
mm,
2 months.
mm,
There seems to be a little coincidence with a lot of my clients that they were told at the IVF clinic that they only had a 2% chance of naturally conceiving.
Really?
That 2% number keeps coming up again and again. And you're saying 3%, which is pretty close.
Mhm.
So it's very interesting to me that so many couples are being told you only have a 2 to 3% chance of conceiving naturally. And that's such a defeating number to
Yes.
hear. But obviously, through the work that we've devoted our lives to, that's not the case. And so it's really an encouraging word. I hope that anyone listening is encouraged by that because there are couples naturally conceiving who were told that they had a 2% chance. That is not always the case. And I would say it's often not the case.
Yeah. Sassy me wants to like be in the doctor's office when they say that and be like, okay, tell me how you got that 2%. Show me from the few labs that you took and the ultrasound you took how you calculated that 2%. I would really like to know.
Preach, Tori, preach.
But yes, just like Caitlin said, if you are someone who has had that spoken over you, I pray that you will release that and just let God's promise and God's truth and trust in yourself flow over that negativity that was spoken over you because it was likely not true in the first place.
Yeah.
What is in these women that you're working with where you're seeing cases like this, what is one of the most common reproductive issues you see through client charting?
Well, there are all sorts of things that come up on cycle charting. So it's certainly not one thing for everyone. I would say every woman's cycle is going to have probably multiple little things because we can see specific issues and also big patterns that kind of paint a more detailed picture of a woman's overall reproductive health. But one of the most common things that I see is unusual bleeding. And so unusual bleeding is something that an OBGYN will often say, well, not much you can do about that. It's probably just hormones. And that answer is not helpful at all. But when you're charting your cycles with the Creighton method, you can actually see what type of unusual bleeding you're having. So for instance, you could be having brown spotting at the end of your period. You could have mid-cycle bleeding. You could have premenstrual spotting, so a lot of spotting leading up to your period flow really beginning. And all of these actually give us information. So in Creighton, these are all under the category of unusual bleeding, but that means that they are unusual. So there's something about them that is off. It's being caused by something. And so the next step is then to identify why. So it could be low progesterone, which is essential for women's health and pregnancy. It could be a uterine polyp or a fibroid. Those cause spotting, and those would need to be removed when you're trying to conceive. It could be chronic endometritis, which is actually an infection of the lining of the uterus. And so that needs to be resolved in order to create a really healthy environment for pregnancy and implantation. But it could also be something like thyroid dysfunction, adenomyosis, or even a bleeding disorder. And all of those matter greatly for early pregnancy. So just because you have a little bit of spotting and you think, oh, well, it doesn't bother me, we don't want to ignore it just because it doesn't bother us or it doesn't bother our OBGYN. It is worth investigating and figuring out why so that we can treat that. Because, like I said earlier, all these little things add up to your overall reproductive health. And we want to make sure that you're as healthy as possible for conception.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I'd like to tell everyone too that when you're taking in all this information about your body and really starting to understand stuff, that it's just information. So if you have spotting or something like that and you think, oh, this could be a polyp, and then you get really scared and it's like this fear is like, it's just information. This is just giving you a starting point. And that's what I love
Yes.
about it too, is that our fertility is not stand still. It's ever changing. And so even if you have some of these things that Caitlin's talking about, like unusual bleeding, it's just information to tell us where to start with. And it's actually a really great thing in our body, giving us the clues we need to have a healthy pregnancy.
Absolutely. And I think it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, Tori, in the sense that often when we have these issues, our medical professionals aren't always giving us ways to treat it and heal it. So it feels hopeless. Oh my goodness, I have all these things going on in my cycle. I'll never be able to conceive. But it's part of changing that mentality, changing that philosophy of women's health to one of restoring that health to optimal, levels and optimal hormone levels and all those things. Because each one of the things that I listed is treatable to some extent. Maybe adenomyosis is the most difficult, but all of those others can be treated fairly easily. So it's really about identifying what's going on and then working with somebody who is going to treat them at their root cause.
Yes, absolutely. So very well said. Caitlin, this was really insightful for me, even as a fertility coach and a nurse. And so I know this was really insightful for everyone listening. So thank you so much for being here. Tell us again where everyone can find you if they want more information about working with you or the Creighton method. Give us some information and links for where to find you. And we'll have these linked in the show notes as well, guys.
Yeah, well, if someone is interested in specifically learning the Creighton model system, which I think is a great start for everyone, then they can actually register anytime on our website for our 1 hour class that helps you get started. So you can go to wovenfertility.com/join us to do that. But if you're wanting a deeper dive into just all that we do, so you want to learn about our free resources or our natural fertility podcast called Woven Well, or our weekly conversations that we have about honoring and exploring our faith as we walk through fertility questions, then I would recommend our monthly newsletter because you can find all of that information there. And that's going to be at the bottom of our homepage at wovenfertility.com.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Caitlin. And for everyone else, I will see you next week. Thanks for hanging out with me today. If this episode touched your heart or taught you something, I'd be honored if you share it with a friend who could use the information too. And if you want to be the real MVP, then would you also take 30 seconds to tap those 5 stars at the bottom and leave a written review telling me what you're loving? It lights me up to know this podcast is really helping you. Don't forget, you're super cute and super fertile, so meet me back here next week and let's keep chatting and learning together.